Hi there and welcome to our latest video where we'll be targeting cruising yachtsmen who wish to dip their toe into the racing scene with some club racing. So if you're an experienced racer, you can switch off now because you'll know all about what I'm about to tell you. I'm here with our experienced skipper and owner of Haven KJ Enigma, Mr. Ian Brahm, and we will be going through various sort of subjects about how to get the best out of your boat for just some basic tips on all that sort of thing. We're going to be going through boat preparation, we're going to be going through a little bit about the rules, we're going to be doing some bit about crew work because we all know about the happy crew will keep you going faster, and then a bit about safety. We are an insurance company after all. So keep on watching, we'll give you loads of little hints and tips that you can use going forward and enjoy your time out on the water. So Ian, let's talk about boat preparation. Where do we start?
Well, as we all know, a smooth hull finish is a fast hull finish. So I guess one of the key points, if you're a cruising sailor, if you want to move into racing, is to get your hull cleaned. The smoother the finish, the faster the boat will go. Simple as that. Then you've got other things to consider, like typically a cruising boat will have lots of gear on board just in case. And as an example might be things like a dinghy and outboard. Very useful if you're anchoring off somewhere, but not particularly useful around the racecourse. So take all the spare gear off, anything you're not going to use while you're out on the racecourse, because that weight will slow you down. Equally, things like full water tanks, full fuel tanks.
It's good to know.
You could be carrying around. You could easily be carrying around 1/4 of a ton of excess gear and fuel and water. So get those things stripped off, you'll go faster. Then it's a case of weight distribution. The more weight you can take out of the ends of the boat, so the bow and stern, the better. If you can congregate that weight in the centre of the boat, above the keel, what you're doing is you're reducing the amount of pitching you'll get as a result of having that weight in the ends, and actually you're contributing to stability, which is also very obviously important when you're racing. So yeah, focus that weight in the middle of the boat.
And where do you stand on kettles?
Kettle's very important, so we'll get on to keeping the crew happy later on. But yeah, a cup of tea at an appropriate moment is really important, so I would absolutely advocate having a kettle on board.
So we're not talking about stripping sort of everything out of the boat, because that I mean, for the people who are just dipping their toe into it, I mean, it's not anything like that extreme. They can still keep the cushions on board, they can still keep a few of the luxuries on board, but obviously they can take them off as well. But where do the rules sort of start to get involved with that? In that, if you start stripping stuff off that's supposed to be on the boat, where does it? How does that sort of come up?
I wouldn't advocate taking much off, other than things that are heavy and you're not going to use on that particular day. Depending on which racing rule you're using for your racing, you might be prevented from doing that anyway. So if your boat is supposed to have cushions on board, you must leave them on board. As simple as that. You obviously need all of your safety kit, and we'll go over that later on. The key thing is just being sensible about it and getting off the heavy items that you don't need. Spare gas cylinders as an example. You know, we talked about the dinghy and outboard. We've talked about spare fuel, spare lines, maybe a second anchor if you don't need it according to the safety rules.
Barbecue.
The barbecue. Well, a lot of boats race with a barbecue. To be
we
fair.
did have a few, didn't we?
So yeah, maybe not. But yeah, just take off. Being sensible, take off the things that make most difference, the heaviest things that you're not going to use.
Perfect. So one of the important things you mentioned earlier was about the hull finish and making sure that the bottom is as smooth as possible. So it's not that hard a task to scrub your bottom, is it?
No, it's not. No, and in fact, the worst of the weed that you'll get on a hull is around the waterline. So it's absolutely practical just to brush from above water, and you'll remove a good proportion of weed on the hull, and that will have a positive effect. You know, having weed on the hull is the worst thing you can have. It's much worse than a poor anti-fouling finish. Ultimately, it's great to have a really, really smooth finish to the hull. but having weed on the hull is the worst thing. So get rid of that first before you start thinking about spending hours and hours rubbing down anti-fouling.
And I mean that must create a huge drag in the water when you got this. You can sort of see boats around us where they've got the sort of beards on them, and this,
Yeah.
and that will really slow you down. And it's such a simple fix.
Yeah, it is a simple fix, and it's one I'd say is probably got to be top of the list if you want to go faster. Get your hull finish as good as it can be.
I mean, we've all seen the America's Cup where you get lawyers involved in protest meetings and things like that, but obviously we're not wanting to get into that sort of level of discussion here. But what are the basics? What are the sort of things that our cruising sailors should know about sort of racing rules and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to have a kind of working knowledge of the main racing rules, the main kind of boat-to-boat racing rules. So that if you're in a close proximity with another boat, you understand who's got right of way and who hasn't. After all, yacht racing is supposed to be a non-contact sport, and none of us wants to end up in a collision. It is a broad subject. If you pick up any racing rule book, it's
a weighty tome.
A weighty tome, and it would take you an awful long time to learn everything. However, the bit to focus on is Part 2 rules, which are the when two boats meet rules. The OIA do a handy little guide as a starting point, and I'd recommend some people getting hold of that and just having a read through.
That looks like quite a thin book.
It is a very thin book, but it's a starting point.
Yeah.
And then this leads into reviewing the rest of the racing rules. But it's things like port and starboard, clear astern, clear ahead, what happens when you get to a mark amongst other boats. Those are the key things you really need to know about.
And I think, I mean, as you said earlier, the avoidance of contact has got to be primary, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it probably makes sense that if you're new to racing, that possibly you back away a little bit more than the serious guys.
We're not really focusing on single-handed sailing, so most of the boats that go out on their club racing will all be sort of have crew on board, and they'll all need to be sort of practiced in the sort of things they do. So what's the best sort of way to keep your crew happy, make sure they know what they're doing, all that sort of thing?
Well, practice is obviously key to getting good crew work. It's no good coming up to a mark ready for a spinnaker hoist and expecting everybody to know what they're supposed to be doing. So what I would recommend is that you go out and practice while you're not racing. So just set a number of hours aside, get out there on the water and just practice every manoeuvre. Because what you'll find is that there's a bit of choreography involved. You need to be able to get people to move efficiently around the boat so that people aren't running into each other as they come in to attack the boat. And as an example, on this boat we've got a main sheet track at the forward end of the cockpit right next to the primary winches. So there isn't enough room for the main sheet trimmer and the two people tacking the boat, tacking the head sail. So what has to happen is the main sheet guy, just before the tack, has to jump into this space here and get out the way of the two guys who are going to be doing all the heavy hauling. And by doing that, that just makes that process efficient. So you need to think about the processes involved in each of the manoeuvres and then go out and practice them.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean you don't need to take hours out of your life to do these sort of things. It can literally be on your next trip out or your next thing like that. You can just do a few practice manoeuvres and things like that. So on that, it's also keeping crew happy on board, making sure communication is good, I suppose,
Yep.
making sure that everybody is well versed in what they're doing and that sort of thing.
Yeah, communication I think is absolutely key. So the best thing you can possibly do is talk about every manoeuvre before it happens, well before it happens. So let's say you're on a beat and you're coming up to the windward mark, and the idea is you're going to bear away, and either if you're just on white sails, you need to retrim your sails, or possibly you're putting a spinnaker up. You need to be talking to the crew, everybody discussing who's doing what, how it's going to all work as we go around the buoy, or rather on the lead up to the buoy, so that when you get to go around the buoy, everybody understands what's going to happen next.
And everyone's in the right place on the boat and
Exactly.
ready to do what they need to do. Absolutely. And obviously, going back to the kettle, you need to keep them happy with tea. Not on the race course, I hasten to add.
Well, possibly between races, that might be a good idea. Yeah, so if everybody's engaged in what's happening through communication, then I think that helps quite a lot. But you've got to keep an eye on people, because obviously if they start to get cold and hungry, then their spirits will drop really quickly and they become less efficient. So, you know, keeping everybody chatting, keeping everybody engaged in what's happening, fed, watered, then that really helps.
Now, we would be remiss as an insurance company if we didn't obviously cover safety and all the sort of safety aspects that go with any races. It's hugely important to make sure that you get all the crew back in one piece, you get the boat back in one piece, but what are the sort of main considerations when it comes to safety? So equipment carried on board, things to look out for on the boat.
Yeah, absolutely. So every yacht race should be run under a set of sailing instructions and a notice of race, and these are documents that will be provided by the club running the sailing, running the racing, and they will specify what requirements you have for safety. And that will be things like, you know, obviously you need to carry a life jacket for each member of the crew. You need to carry things like fire extinguishers. You need flares normally, and you need to also make sure that the equipment on the boat is functioning correctly and it's not going to cause a danger to everybody. And you know, just as a simple example would be things like guard wires. Very often guard wires are secured at one of the two ends by lashing bits of string, and so if they haven't been replaced in 10 years, maybe it's time to replace them, just to be sure that that's not going to give way and someone's going to go over the side. So the key priority is, as you said, is not winning races, it's actually everybody having a good time safely. And so I think that's the sort of the way that skippers need to look at it. It's always the skipper's decision whether he goes racing, and it has to be his decision whether he continues racing. And so, you know, and that has to be based on the safety considerations at the time. So if the weather starts to sort of deteriorate and you're not comfortable, best pack it in and go in.
Yeah, I must admit, I am glad you checked those lashings. The amount of times I've been hanging off that rail over the years while we've been up on the V. No, that's always a good consideration. I mean, it is so important that, you know, the safety of the people you take out with you, and, you know, as you say, it is the skipper's responsibility for everyone on board as much as anything else.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, particularly when you're starting racing. You know, it's supposed to be a pleasurable thing to do. So let's keep it light, don't take any risks, get everybody home happy and safe, and hopefully you'll have had a nice day on the water in the process.
Here are some clips of Haven KJ Enigma out on the water. We'll show you some manoeuvres we've done and the crew work that goes together to make sure they all run as smoothly as possible. We hope you enjoy them.